For your warm-up questions, we're trying to think, can you cut a line in half? And this would be no, because a line, as you saw in the investigation, looks like it's running off your computer screen, and it goes on and on forever, both directions. Okay, in order to find the average of two numbers, let's say it was 57 and 94, we would add up both numbers and then divide by 2 since there were two numbers. If we were trying to find the average of 10 numbers, we'd add them all up and divide by 10. So in this case here, our average is 75.5. That average is like the middle of the two numbers. How many wheels does a bicycle have? Well, that's 2, so this word or this prefix by here means 2, and we'll be using that in a little bit. So the midpoint, think middle, of a segment is the point on the segment that's the same distance from both endpoints. It's right in the middle. The midpoint bisects the segment. Here's our prefix bi. That means it divides the segment into two congruent parts. It cuts the segment right in half. So in this first example, we want to name each midpoint in the segment it bisects. Here, the midpoint is R. Of the segment PQ. Remember, I'm going to use two letters to name the segment. Going to have my segment bar above it. And we know it's the midpoint, not just because it looks like it's right in the middle, but because the distance from R to Q is the same as the distance from R to P. We know these segments are congruent, PR and RQ, so we know it's right in the middle. Here we have a couple different midpoints. X is the midpoint of segment YW, since it's congruent from WX to XY. Y is the midpoint of XZ, since XY and YZ are congruent. And lastly, here we see that segment CB and segment AB are congruent, but B is not a midpoint because because B is not on the same segment as CA. So we're trying to find the midpoint of a segment with endpoints. We'll say x1, y1. You should have seen these before when you were calculating slope, and x2, y2, by using the average. So we're going to add up the x variables, divide by 2. We found the average of the x's. We're going to find the average of the y's. That way we'll find the midpoint right in the middle. So for example 2, we can say here's x1, y1, here's x2, y2. Add them up. So we're averaging our x's, dividing by 2, adding up our y values, dividing by 2. So we end up with 3 halves and 18 halves. But we know that 3 halves really reduces, that 18 halves really reduces to 9. We have -4 and -7, same thing. Find the average of the x coordinates. Find the average of the y coordinates. Add them up, divide by 2. So if we reduce our fractions, the midpoint here is really 3, -5. And now let's say that we were looking at a graph. Well, we'd be able to find the endpoints. Here we're at point Z at -4, 4. Here we're at point W at 5, -1. So we'd have to, again, add up our x values, divide by 2, add up our y values, divide by 2, and we'd be at 1/2 and 3/2. If you like decimals, you're at 0.5, 1.5. So if we look here, we can mark in the segment. We're at 0.5, 1.5. And that should look like it's right in the middle. Okay, and since it's in the middle, that means our midpoint here, let's just call it x. Our midpoint, or sorry, segment ZX would be congruent to segment XW. So we're going to mark those in that it's congruent. Okay, same thing with B. Start by finding your coordinates of the endpoints. Here's K at 1, 5. Here's J at -6, 0. So we need to add up the x values, divide by 2, oops. So we're at -5/2, +5/2, or again, if you don't like fractions, we're at -2.5, +2.5. So if we double check our answer by putting it on the graph, -1, 2.5, +2.5, our point looks to be in the middle, and we can mark those two segments congruent. It's bisecting the segment, cutting it into two equal segments. If we were to use a ruler and draw a segment AB with length 5 centimeters, we could find the midpoint by cutting 5 in half. So really we'd have to measure out 2.5 centimeters and put the midpoint there. So here we've cut it into 2.5 centimeter pieces. That would be the midpoint. Remember, this is segment AB. Got to label those endpoints. Same thing, if we had our ruler, we measured something that was 4 inches. Well, 4 divided by 2 is 2. So our midpoint's at 2 inches from each endpoint. We can mark those congruent. Those are each 2-inch segments. And this is bisecting segment CD. Sorry, that's a D there.